The unexpected shock. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the rocky landscape. It was a strange place, alien and wild. Deep in the heart of this foreign planet, the air was thick with tension. A deadly creature, half the size of a mountain, paced in front of two figures, Vira, an alien girl, and Jackson, a human warrior. The predator was massive, its black scales gleaming in the light. Its eyes, bright red and full of hunger, locked onto Jackson. Vera stood still, her breath shallow. She had heard stories about humans, about their fragility. But standing next to Jackson, she was beginning to question everything she thought she knew. The human was calm, his face set in a hard expression of determination. He gripped his weapon tightly, ready to face the beast. "Jackson, you should leave. You can't beat it. It's too strong," Vera warned, her voice trembling slightly. She had seen the way the creature moved, too fast, too powerful for any being, let alone a human. Jackson turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers. A small, reassuring smile crossed his lips. "You don't know humans," he said softly. "We don't give up." Vira wanted to protest, but before she could, the creature lunged. Its enormous claws slashed the air with a terrifying roar. Jackson was quick, dodging the first attack with an agility that surprised Vera. He moved like a shadow, swift and graceful, despite the weight of his armor. The predator growled in frustration and swung again, its massive claws aiming for Jackson's side. Vira watched in horror as the creature's claws connected with Jackson's arm. A sickening snap echoed across the landscape. Jackson screamed, his face contorting in agony as his bones shattered under the creature's blow. Vera gasped, her eyes wide with shock. Blood spilled from his injury, staining the ground beneath him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Vera expected Jackson to collapse, to fall to the ground in pain, helpless before the monster. But instead, he did something that left her stunned. He laughed. The sound was strange, almost manic, yet strangely comforting. His voice echoed across the rocky terrain as he forced himself to stand, his body trembling with the effort. He didn't scream in pain. He didn't beg for mercy. Jackson simply laughed through the agony. "Is that the best you've got?" he said between chuckles, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His teeth were gritted, but his eyes glinted with defiance. The creature snarled, confused by the human's reaction. Vira couldn't understand. She had seen beings endure pain, but never like this. To her, it was unthinkable that someone could laugh while their bones were broken, their blood spilling onto the ground. She had been raised to believe that pain was the ultimate weakness, that any creature who could not avoid or escape pain was doomed. But Jackson was different. He didn't show fear. He didn't even show pain. How can you laugh?" Vera asked, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him, watching in disbelief as Jackson moved to face the creature once again. His broken arm hung limply at his side, but he raised his weapon, ready to continue the fight. Jackson's smile faded slightly as he locked eyes with Vera. His voice was steady, despite the obvious pain. "Pain doesn't stop us. We just keep going. It's the human way." Vira's heart raced in her chest. She had heard the stories, of course. She had been told that humans were weak, that they would break under pressure, crumble under the weight of their own fragility. But seeing Jackson now, standing tall despite his injury, laughing in the face of it was nothing like what she had been taught. Jackson took a step forward, his injured arm hanging at an odd angle, but his legs were firm beneath him. He didn't back away. Instead, he charged. The creature, enraged by the human's defiance, attacked again. This time, Jackson was ready. With a wild roar, he swung his weapon, aiming for the beast's neck. His broken arm screamed in pain, but Jackson pushed through it, his determination clear. The creature's thick hide resisted at first, but with one final strike, Jackson plunged his weapon deep into the beast's side. The creature let out a shriek and staggered back, stunned. Vyra couldn't believe her eyes. She had never seen anything like this before. She had always believed that survival was about power, about strength. But Jackson wasn't the strongest, not by any means. Yet here he was, standing tall against an enemy that should have killed him, his laughter still echoing in the air. The creature, weakened but still dangerous, recoiled from the strike. Jackson was breathing heavily now, his face pale, sweat dripping from his forehead. His body was clearly pushing beyond its limits. Yet he stood there, waiting for the creature to make its next move. "Jackson, you're insane," Vera said, her voice full of disbelief. She didn't understand him. She didn't understand how someone could endure so much and still keep fighting, still keep laughing. Jackson's grin returned, despite the blood trickling down his face. "Maybe, but that's what makes us human. We laugh through the pain." Vyra felt a chill run down her spine. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was watching a human or a warrior. She didn't know which was stronger, the pain or the human will to survive. But one thing was certain. She had never seen anything like this before. And now, more than ever, she was desperate to know what made this human so different. Unfamiliar resilience. The creature was retreating, its blood staining the ground as it disappeared into the shadows of the alien landscape. The battle had ended, but the air was thick with tension, heavy with the knowledge that the fight had just begun for Jackson. He stood there, breathing heavily, his body battered and broken. His arm hung uselessly by his side, and his face was smeared with dirt and blood. Yet, despite the clear signs of his injuries, Jackson wasn't slowing down. He was still standing, still moving. Vyra's eyes were wide with disbelief. She had never seen anything like this before. The human she had witnessed in battle was nothing like the fragile, weak creatures she had been taught to believe them to be. He was something entirely different, something far more dangerous. Jackson turned his gaze to her, his smile still on his lips despite the pain that radiated through his body. His eyes held a strange fire, something that Vera couldn't quite understand. It wasn't fear or desperation. It was something deeper, something that made her uneasy. It was defiance. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jackson said, his voice rough but full of life. "You're not scared, are you?" Vera shook her head, still struggling to process what she had just witnessed. She had seen warriors fight before, but nothing like this. Nothing even close. Most beings, when faced with a wound like the one Jackson had suffered, would have either passed out or succumbed to the pain. But Jackson had laughed, and he had kept fighting. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "How can you stand like this? How are you still fighting? You're hurt." Jackson didn't answer at first. Instead, he took a deep breath and glanced down at his arm. His bones had shattered under the creature's attack, and blood had seeped from the wound, but his eyes were focused. The pain was there, of course. He could feel it, gnawing at him, but it didn't stop him. It didn't control him. "You're right," Jackson said, his tone steady. "I'm hurt, but that doesn't mean I'm done." Vyra frowned, confused. The more she watched him, the more questions flooded her mind. She had been taught that pain was a weakness. In her world, any creature that couldn't avoid or escape pain was doomed. Pain broke minds. Pain destroyed spirits. And yet Jackson, this human, was standing before her, grinning through the agony, like he didn't even care. How can you laugh? How can you keep fighting through something like that?" Vera asked, the words tumbling from her lips in disbelief. "Isn't it too much?" Jackson's smile faded for a moment, and his eyes softened just slightly. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "It's not about the pain, Vera," he said quietly. "It's about not letting it stop you. You see, the thing about humans is, we don't give up. No matter how bad it gets, we keep going." Vera blinked, trying to process his words. She had never understood the concept of pushing through pain like that. Her people were strong, yes, but they had always been taught to avoid pain, to find ways around it. If you were hurt, you sought healing. You didn't keep going. You rested, you recovered. Pain was a sign of weakness. But Jackson was showing her something different, something that she couldn't wrap her mind around. You say you don't give up. Vira's voice trailed off as she took a cautious step forward. But why? What's the point? Jackson's expression grew more serious as he turned to face her fully. He shifted his weight, clearly in pain, but still standing tall. His broken arm hung at his side, and yet there was no sign of surrender in him. Instead, there was a quiet strength that Vira hadn't seen before. "It's not about the pain," he repeated. "It's about what comes after. Every time we fall, every time we get hurt, we get back up. And that makes us stronger. We don't give up because we know that we can overcome anything. Pain is temporary. Our will to survive, that's what lasts." Vira stared at him, her mind racing. She had never heard anyone speak like that before. She had always been taught that survival was about power, about force. You had to be stronger than your enemies, faster than your foes. But Jackson was showing her a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on physical power alone. She had always seen pain as something to be avoided at all costs. To her, pain was a sign that something had gone wrong, that you were failing. But Jackson didn't see pain as a sign of failure. He saw it as a challenge, a test, and he passed that test every time. Vira took another step forward, her curiosity growing stronger. "Is that how humans survive?" she asked. "You just keep going." Jackson's lips curved into a half-smile, and he nodded slowly. "Exactly. It's not about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about refusing to let anything stop you. You learn to laugh through the pain, because when you laugh, you're not giving in. You're winning." Vira absorbed his words in silence. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if everything she had been taught was true. Jackson was an enigma. Everything about him was different from what she had learned, and yet there was something undeniably powerful about his resilience. She couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the human way? Could she, too, learn to laugh through the pain? Could she find strength in the face of suffering, the way Jackson had? As she watched him begin to move again, despite his injuries, she knew one thing for sure. The journey ahead would change her forever. And somehow, in some way, she would come to understand the strange power that lay in Jackson's defiant laughter. Jackson's hidden past. The night was falling fast, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky above the rocky terrain. Vera sat by a small fire, watching as the flames flickered and danced. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, the images of the battle still fresh in her thoughts. Jackson's strange laughter, his refusal to give up despite his injuries. Nothing about him made sense. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how little she understood. How could a human be so different? Jackson sat a few feet away from her, his back against a rock, staring out into the dark. His expression was unreadable, but the pain was still evident in his eyes. The arm that had been shattered in the battle earlier was now wrapped in a makeshift bandage, but it still hung awkwardly by his side. He didn't seem to care much about the discomfort, though. His focus was elsewhere, lost in his thoughts. Vira, despite her desire to remain aloof, felt an urge to speak. She had to know more. She needed to understand. Something in Jackson's spirit had stirred something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore. "Jackson," she began, her voice tentative. "How did you get to be this way? This resilient?" Jackson didn't immediately respond. He took a deep breath, then slowly turned to face her. His eyes, though weary, held a kind of strength that Vera couldn't quite place. There was a heaviness to them, a depth that spoke of a life lived through hardships, things he wasn't eager to share, yet he somehow seemed willing to let her see. "It's a long story," he said quietly, his voice rough. "But if you want to understand, I'll tell you." Vera nodded, her curiosity piqued. She had no idea what kind of story Jackson was about to tell, but she was certain it would explain the things she couldn't make sense of. Jackson sighed, his gaze distant as he began to speak. I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always. The way you see me now. When I was younger, I was just like any other kid, growing up in a world that was harsh and unforgiving. I learned early on that if you didn't fight for what you wanted, you wouldn't survive. Not where I came from. People get lost. They get left behind. Vyra listened intently, her mind trying to grasp the idea of a world so cruel. In her life, pain was something that came and went. They could heal. They could recover. But Jackson's world sounded different, more dangerous, less forgiving. Jackson paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. My parents were good people, he continued, his voice quiet. But they didn't have much. We lived in a small town where survival was a daily struggle. There was always a sense of fear, a sense of fighting. You fight to eat. You fight to stay warm. You fight to keep the people you love safe. I learned how to fight before I learned how to walk. Vyra frowned, her heart heavy with sympathy. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Jackson, growing up in a place where every day felt like a battle. Her world, for all its challenges, had never been so unforgiving. Was it always like that? She asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. Always fighting. Jackson's eyes darkened slightly as he looked down at the ground, his face hardening. Yeah, he muttered. It was. And then, one day, everything changed. The people I thought I could count on, they weren't there anymore. He paused, his chest rising and falling with a deep breath. I lost everything. The people I loved, the people I fought to protect. Gone. Just like that. Vyra could feel the weight of his words in the stillness of the night. She could hear the pain beneath them, the loss that had shaped him into the person he was now. There was a part of her that wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but she didn't know how. She didn't know how to ease the kind of pain Jackson had carried with him all these years. How did you keep going? She asked, her voice filled with awe and curiosity. After everything you lost, how did you keep moving forward? Jackson looked up at her then, his gaze unwavering. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a glimmer of something that told her he wasn't afraid to show her the truth, even if it was raw and painful. I didn't have a choice, he said simply. I could have given up. I could have let the pain take over, let it destroy me. But the thing is, I learned that when you let pain define you, you lose. You stop being the person you were meant to be. You let the world win. He looked away then, his jaw tightening. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not to me. Not to the people I lost. Vyra sat there in silence, her mind racing. The strength she had seen in Jackson earlier, the way he laughed through the pain, it all made sense now. It wasn't just something he had learned. It was a part of who he was, something he had to become in order to survive. You're different, she said slowly, her voice filled with wonder. You don't let anything break you. Jackson smiled faintly, though there was a sadness in his eyes. No, I don't. Because if I do, then everything I've been through, everything I've survived, it would all be for nothing. And I can't let that happen. Vyra felt a strange sense of admiration for him, mixed with something else, something she couldn't name. There was a quiet power in Jackson's words, a strength that didn't come from physical force, but from the way he had learned to overcome his own pain. It was something she had never seen before, and it made her question everything she had ever believed about strength and survival. As the fire crackled between them, Vyra felt a shift in her understanding. Jackson wasn't just a human warrior. He was a survivor. And that was something far greater than just strength. Growing trust. The air was cool as the two travelers made their way across the rocky plains, the distant hum of alien creatures filling the silence between them. Vyra had been walking beside Jackson for hours, but the events of the previous days weighed heavily on her mind. The more she learned about Jackson's past, the more she realized how little she truly understood about the world he came from. His strength, his resilience, and the way he had faced unimaginable pain. It was unlike anything she had ever encountered. The firelight from last night still flickered in her thoughts. Jackson had been so open about his past, sharing the heartbreak and loss that had shaped him. Yet, despite everything he had gone through, he still carried an unwavering determination to move forward. That was something Vira couldn't ignore. She found herself questioning everything she had been taught about humans, about strength, and about survival. They walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but for the first time, Vera felt an unspoken understanding growing between them. There was no longer the barrier of disbelief and distance between them. She no longer saw Jackson as just a human, a weak, fragile being. She saw him for what he was, a survivor, and that made him dangerous in a way she had never imagined. "You're quiet today," Jackson remarked, his voice breaking the stillness. Vera glanced at him, momentarily taken off guard. She hadn't realized how absorbed she had become in her thoughts. She had always prided herself on being in control, on being able to maintain her composure no matter the situation. But Jackson had a way of unsettling her in a way she couldn't explain. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice uncertain, "about what you told me, about your past." Jackson raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "Yeah," he said, his tone light. "What about it?" Vira hesitated. She had been so sure of everything before, sure of the teachings of her people, sure of the way the world worked. But now, the things Jackson had told her made her question all of that. She had seen how resilient he was, how he laughed in the face of pain. She had seen him overcome battles, both physical and emotional. But there was something deeper, something raw beneath the surface that made her wonder how much of his strength was truly human. "You talk about pain like it's just something to get through," Vera said slowly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Like it doesn't affect you at all. But I don't understand. How can you just brush it off? How can you still keep going after everything you've been through?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. He continued walking, his gaze fixed ahead, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet recognition. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of his words. "It's not that I don't feel the pain," Jackson said, his voice soft. "I feel it every day. It's always there, lurking beneath the surface. But I've learned to live with it. I've learned that pain isn't something that defines you. It's how you handle it that matters. Pain is just a part of life, Vira. You can either let it break you, or you can use it to make you stronger." Vira looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. It was difficult to imagine living with that kind of mentality, especially given what she had seen and experienced. To her, pain had always been something to avoid, something to heal from as quickly as possible. But Jackson was saying something different. He wasn't trying to escape pain, he was trying to embrace it. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice tinged with doubt. "Like it's just a choice." Jackson chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. It was dry, almost bitter, as though he had heard that question many times before. "If only it were that simple," he said quietly. "It's not easy, not by any means, but sometimes, when you've been through enough, you learn to stop fighting against the pain. You start fighting with it. You learn to use it to keep moving forward. It's the only way to survive. Trust me." Vira was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been taught that survival was about strength, physical power, mental toughness, and the ability to avoid weakness. But Jackson's way of thinking was completely different. He didn't avoid pain. He didn't hide from it. He faced it head-on, every day, and somehow, he managed to keep going. The thought was both unnerving and fascinating. "So, you don't fear the pain?" Vera asked, her voice almost a whisper. Jackson stopped walking, turning to face her. There was no anger or frustration in his expression, only a calm certainty. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't fear it. Pain isn't something to be afraid of. It's just a part of life. What matters is how you face it. What matters is whether you let it control you or whether you learn to control it." Vera stood still for a long moment, staring at him. She had never heard anyone speak like this before. It was foreign to her, this idea of embracing pain, of allowing it to be a part of who you were. She had always thought of pain as something to be feared, something to be avoided at all costs. But Jackson was showing her something different. He was showing her a strength she hadn't known existed, a strength that came not from avoiding the hurt, but from enduring it. Maybe I have a lot to learn from you," Vera said softly, her voice barely audible. Jackson smiled, but there was no arrogance in it. It was a simple, knowing smile, one that spoke of understanding. "You're learning already," he said, his tone gentle. "Sometimes the hardest lessons come from the pain, but they make you who you are." Vera couldn't help but feel a shift within herself. It was as if something had clicked, something deep within her, something she had never questioned before. She had always thought of herself as strong. Her people had taught her to be. But Jackson's words, his resilience, made her question if strength was more than just physical power. Maybe, just maybe, it was the ability to endure, to grow stronger with each blow life dealt. As they continued walking, Vera realized that this journey wasn't just about surviving the dangers of the alien world. It was about understanding herself, about learning from Jackson and the way he saw the world. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to face whatever came next, with the same resilience Jackson had shown her. The journey was just beginning, and Vera knew that the lessons would keep coming: pain, strength, and trust. But with every step, she was learning to embrace them, just as Jackson had. And maybe, just maybe, that was the key to surviving this strange new world. The dark truth. The days were starting to blur together, each one filled with their own struggles, but also their own strange quiet moments of reflection. As Vera and Jackson continued to travel, their bond deepened. They were no longer just allies forced together by circumstance. Something had changed between them. The journey through the harsh, unforgiving terrain of the alien world was not only testing their physical limits, but also pushing the boundaries of their understanding. They were learning about each other, yes, but more than that, they were beginning to confront truths they hadn't yet acknowledged. It was late in the evening when Vera first noticed the subtle shift in Jackson. They had set up camp near the edge of a ravine. The sky stretched out above them like a canvas of fading stars. Jackson was quieter than usual, his usual easy confidence replaced by something more distant, more brooding. He sat by the fire, absently tending to the flames, his gaze far off, lost in the flickering shadows. Vera, who had grown more attuned to his moods, watched him closely. She had noticed this change before, a subtle darkening of his mood, whenever they talked about the past. Whenever they came close to the things that haunted him, Jackson would retreat into himself. It was as if there was a part of him that he wasn't ready to face, or perhaps couldn't face. But tonight, there was something different in the air, something that felt almost like an invitation. "Jackson," Vera said softly, breaking the silence. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach this delicate subject. "You've been quiet all evening. Something's bothering you. Is it the pain?" Jackson's eyes flickered briefly toward her, but he didn't answer right away. He looked away again, staring at the fire, his face expressionless. But Vera knew better. She had spent enough time with him to see the cracks in his armor, the way his emotions slipped through the cracks even when he tried to hide them. "I'm fine," he said, his voice a little too flat, the words almost robotic. It was clear he wasn't telling the truth, but Vera didn't press him. Instead, she sat down beside him, crossing her legs and looking up at the sky. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, the wind howled softly across the ravine, and the world around them seemed to fade into a quiet lull. Then finally, Jackson spoke again, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I never told you the whole story," he said, the words coming out slowly, as if he was weighing them carefully. "I told you about the loss, about the people I cared for. But I didn't tell you how it happened." Vira didn't move, didn't speak. She didn't need to. She knew that he needed to say this, needed to share the part of his story he had kept buried for so long. She had seen enough of him to know that the weight of those untold truths was far heavier than any of the injuries he had suffered. Jackson took a deep breath and finally met her gaze. His eyes were shadowed, haunted by something that ran deeper than physical pain. "It wasn't just a random attack," he said, his voice tight. "It wasn't an accident. It was a betrayal." Vira's heart skipped a beat. Betrayal. The word hung in the air, heavy and cold. She had known that Jackson's past wasn't just filled with loss. It had been marked by something far darker, something he had never wanted to talk about. But betrayal, that was something different. That was personal. "What do you mean?" Vera asked, her voice gentle. "Who betrayed you?" Jackson's gaze dropped, his fists clenching at his sides as if the memory alone was enough to make his body tense with rage. He seemed to shrink in on himself, the weight of his pain almost visible as he spoke. "There was a group I trusted," he continued, his voice becoming rough. "We were all part of a small resistance, fighting against a corrupt government that controlled everything. We were trying to make things better for the people. We were fighting for something bigger than ourselves, for something worth dying for." He paused, his expression hardening, his jaw clenching. "And in the end, we all died. All of us." Vira's heart ached as she listened. She knew enough about Jackson's world to understand the kind of conflict he was describing. The sort of brutal, oppressive government that forced people into desperate situations. But hearing him speak of it so personally, with such raw emotion, made her realize just how deep the wounds from his past ran. Who betrayed you?" Vera asked again, this time with more urgency. She could see that this was the part of the story that Jackson had never shared with anyone, the part that still had the power to unravel him. Jackson's eyes flickered briefly toward her before he looked away again, staring into the fire as if the flames might give him the answers he needed. "It was someone I trusted," he said slowly. "A close friend. Someone I thought had the same values, the same goals. But in the end, they sold us out. They gave up our position to the enemy. And the next thing I knew, my whole team was wiped out. Every single one of them." Vira's breath caught in her throat. She could see the anguish in Jackson's eyes, the guilt, the pain. He had lost more than just his comrades that day. He had lost a part of himself, a part he would never be able to reclaim. "I couldn't stop it," Jackson whispered, the words barely audible. "I was supposed to protect them, keep them safe. But I failed. And that failure, it haunts me every day." Vira felt a pang of empathy for him. She had never known a betrayal so deep, so personal. She couldn't imagine what it must have been like for Jackson to lose everything, not because of an enemy's strength, but because of someone he had once called a friend. "Jackson, you weren't the one who betrayed them," Vera said softly, her voice steady. "You can't carry that burden alone." Jackson turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers with a depth of emotion she hadn't expected. There was vulnerability in them, raw and unguarded. It was the first time she had seen him like this, unmasked, unprotected. "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't change the fact that they're all gone. And I'm still here. I'm still standing, still fighting. I don't know why, Vira. I don't know what I'm fighting for anymore." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, the wind whispered through the ravine, and the weight of Jackson's words hung in the air. Vera didn't have the answers he was looking for, but she knew one thing. Jackson wasn't alone anymore. "You're not alone," she said firmly. "You have me, and I believe in you." Jackson looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if trying to decide whether to believe her. And then, slowly, he nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "I don't know what comes next," Jackson said quietly, "but I know I can't keep running from my past. I have to face it." Vera nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Jackson's journey was far from over. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they would face whatever came next. They would face the pain, the betrayal, and the darkness. Together. Battle for survival. The dawn broke over the alien world, spilling soft, golden light across the rough, barren landscape. Despite its gentle glow, the morning air felt tense, filled with the heavy promise of danger. Vera and Jackson stood quietly at the edge of a vast valley, overlooking an ominous fortress rising from the rocky hills ahead. It was an ancient structure, dark and imposing, covered in sharp edges and spikes, home to those who had hunted them relentlessly for days. Jackson's wounds had only partially healed, his broken arm still wrapped in the cloth bandage Vera had applied earlier. He moved stiffly, and each step betrayed a shadow of pain, yet his eyes burned fiercely, refusing to surrender to weakness. Vera studied him quietly, amazed and worried by his stubborn determination. She admired his strength, but feared he was pushing himself too far. To her, he seemed invincible yet fragile all at once, strong enough to endure anything, yet frighteningly vulnerable beneath the surface. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Vera asked, concern clear in her voice. "You haven't fully recovered yet." Jackson gave her a faint smile, brushing away her concern. "If I wait until I'm fully healed, it'll be too late," he replied firmly. "Pain is temporary, remember." Vera nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in her eyes. She had begun to understand the strength of humans, their strange resilience and stubbornness, but seeing Jackson push himself like this was still deeply troubling. To her, the line between bravery and recklessness was becoming blurred. As they approached the enemy's territory, the tension increased with every passing moment. The alien forces had gathered, their numbers swelling, preparing for a final assault. Their leader, a ruthless creature named Kaler, had sent scouts to hunt Jackson down. To Kaler, humans were weak, a threat easily crushed beneath his power. But Kaler had made a mistake, underestimating Jackson's resolve. A sudden noise snapped Vera's attention back to the present. Footsteps echoed loudly, growing closer and louder. From the shadows emerged several alien warriors, armed and armored, their eyes glowing with menace. Jackson instinctively stepped forward, shielding Vera. "Stay behind me," Jackson said quietly, his voice tense but steady. Before Vera could protest, Kaler himself stepped out from behind his warriors, towering over them. His massive frame radiated dominance, his skin covered in intricate battle scars. He sneered at Jackson, amusement clear in his cold eyes. "So this is the famous human warrior," Kaler growled mockingly. "I expected someone stronger, but all I see is a broken creature, ready to shatter." Jackson met Kaler's gaze without flinching. "You underestimate us all," he replied calmly. "My bones may break, but my spirit never will." Kaler laughed loudly, a chilling sound echoing through the air. "Your bones snap as easily as twigs, yet you stand defiant. Foolish bravery." "It's not bravery," Jackson countered, voice firm. "It's resilience." Kaler narrowed his eyes, irritation replacing his amusement. "Enough. Finish him." His warriors moved forward instantly, weapons raised, surrounding Jackson and Vera. Vera drew her own weapon, stepping protectively closer to Jackson, prepared to defend him at any cost. Yet deep inside, fear gripped her. She knew Jackson was badly wounded, and that this battle might finally break him, physically at least. The warriors attacked swiftly, their weapons slashing through the air. Jackson, despite his injuries, fought back ferociously. He ducked and dodged with remarkable agility, fighting with only one good arm. Each movement sent shockwaves of agony through him, but he refused to give in. His eyes flashed with that familiar defiance, refusing to surrender, refusing to back down. Vera joined him, fighting fiercely by his side, driven by a newfound admiration for Jackson's courage. But the enemy numbers were overwhelming. For every warrior they defeated, 2 more stepped forward. Exhaustion threatened to claim Jackson, and Vera noticed his movements growing slower, his breath harsher with each strike. In one desperate moment, a powerful blow knocked Jackson backward. He stumbled, falling hard onto the rough ground. Pain exploded through his injured arm, causing him to cry out sharply. For a brief moment, everything went dark. His vision blurred, the sounds of battle distant and muffled. "Jackson!" Vera screamed, rushing toward him. Her heart pounded fiercely, panic gripping her as she saw him struggling to rise. The alien warriors advanced, ready to end the fight once and for all. Yet even then, Jackson refused to remain down. With a fierce shout, he forced himself upright, his entire body trembling from exertion. Sweat and blood dripped down his face, yet his determination remained unshaken. "You see," Kaler laughed coldly, "humans break easily. Your strength is nothing." Jackson looked up at Kaler, his gaze unwavering despite his obvious agony. "You're wrong," he gasped, forcing himself to stand tall. "Strength isn't about never breaking. It's about refusing to stay broken." Vera felt her breath catch in her throat. Jackson's words resonated deeply, shattering something inside her, the belief system she'd held her entire life. Strength wasn't about never being wounded. It was about rising again, refusing defeat even when the odds were overwhelming. Inspired by Jackson's resolve, Vera joined him fiercely in the fight. Together, they battled with renewed vigor, pushing their attackers back. Despite their exhaustion, they fought like a force of nature, their bond stronger than ever. Kaler watched in disbelief, unable to comprehend how the seemingly weak human was still standing. Fury consumed him, clouding his judgment. He charged toward Jackson, determined to crush him once and for all. But Vera intercepted, striking Kaler with unexpected force. "You underestimate humans," she said, standing protectively before Jackson. "Their strength isn't in bones or muscle. It's in their spirit. And now, it's in mine." Kaler growled in anger, striking violently, but Vera fought back bravely, her newfound courage matching Jackson's own resilience. In that moment, the two became unstoppable, pushing Kaler and his warriors to retreat. With their attackers defeated, Jackson and Vera stood side by side, exhausted but triumphant. Jackson's breath came in painful gasps, but a faint smile curled on his lips. "You okay?" Vera asked gently, helping him steady himself. Jackson nodded, smiling weakly but confidently. "As long as I can laugh through the pain, I'll always be okay." Vera smiled back, feeling an intense wave of pride and admiration. She had finally understood. Pain wasn't weakness. It was a test of spirit, a chance to grow stronger, braver, better. And as they faced the uncertain path ahead, Vera knew they'd overcome whatever came next, side by side, unstoppable in their resolve. Because now, she carried within her the same defiant resilience, the same incredible spirit that she had learned from Jackson. Together, they would face the future, no longer afraid, but ready to laugh through the pain. They stood tall, ready for whatever came next, knowing their bond was unbreakable. And in that moment, Vera knew without a doubt, they were survivors, laughing through the victory. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and exhaustion. The battle had ended, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. Kaler and his warriors had vanished, leaving only echoes of their defeat behind. Vera stood quietly, her chest heaving with effort. Her gaze drifted to Jackson, who stood slightly hunched but stubbornly upright, breathing hard. His injured arm was still tightly wrapped, but despite the pain, he managed a triumphant smile. Vera couldn't help but smile back, amazed at the man standing before her. Jackson had faced impossible odds, endured injuries that would have defeated anyone else, and yet he stood there victorious. For the first time, she fully grasped the true meaning behind his laughter, the strength hidden beneath his pain. Jackson lifted his head, his eyes bright with determination, and something else. Hope. He glanced at Vira, who had now become more than just a traveling companion. She was his friend, someone he deeply trusted. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice sincere, carrying the weight of his gratitude. "I wouldn't have made it without you." Vira looked away for a moment, the warmth in his words touching something deep within her heart. She had always thought humans were creatures who survived on luck or chance. But watching Jackson had opened her eyes. Humans didn't rely on luck. They created their own path through sheer determination. "I didn't do much," she said softly, humility clear in her tone. "You're the one who never gave up." Jackson shook his head slowly, his eyes gentle yet firm. "You're wrong, Vira. I kept fighting because you believed in me. Sometimes that's all we need, someone who sees the strength we have inside, even when we can't see it ourselves." She was quiet for a moment, taking his words to heart. Throughout their journey, she had discovered a part of herself she had never known existed. She had always believed that survival meant avoiding pain, avoiding weakness at all costs. Now she realized that true strength wasn't in escaping pain. It was in accepting it, facing it, and overcoming it. Vira finally met his gaze again, her eyes glistening slightly. "You taught me something important, Jackson. You showed me strength isn't just about power. It's about not letting your pain defeat you." Jackson smiled again, this time warmly, the relief evident in his eyes. "Exactly. Pain is only temporary. It comes and goes. But if you let it control you, you'll lose yourself." A brief silence settled between them, comfortable and meaningful. Both felt something shifting deeply within, a transformation that went beyond mere survival. They had both changed profoundly during their journey, shaped by pain, loss, and resilience. Just then, a faint noise echoed from the distance, a gentle rumbling, low and continuous, like distant thunder. Vira and Jackson exchanged tense glances, instantly alert. The fight, it seemed, wasn't entirely over. "We should keep moving," Vira said softly, though determination flickered in her voice. "We need shelter before the next danger finds us." Jackson nodded, his stance stiffening slightly. He pushed himself forward, ignoring the sharp ache in his bones. Each step hurt, but he kept walking, a subtle smile still on his lips. Together, they moved cautiously, climbing over jagged rocks and through narrow valleys, always aware of the presence lurking just beyond their sight. Hours passed, their bodies screaming in exhaustion, but their spirits remained strong. As darkness began to settle again, they finally stopped to rest near a sheltered cliff. Vera carefully built another small fire, its soft glow pushing away the darkness surrounding them. She glanced toward Jackson, noticing how pale his face had become. The toll of his injuries was becoming clearer by the minute. "Let me see your arm," she said gently, stepping closer. Jackson sighed but didn't protest as Vera carefully removed the cloth. He winced as she checked the injury. His arm was badly bruised, the bone still damaged, though slowly healing. He kept quiet, enduring the pain without complaint. Vera paused, studying him with deep admiration. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked softly. "Handling the pain, I mean." Jackson chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "No, but you get stronger. Every time it hurts, you get better at enduring. You realize the pain doesn't own you. It teaches you." Vira nodded slowly. "Maybe someday I'll learn that too." "You already have," Jackson replied gently. "You faced your fear back there. You stood against Kaler. You fought by my side, knowing we could both be killed. You've already learned to laugh through the pain, even if you don't realize it yet." Vira smiled faintly, the warmth of his words easing the heaviness in her heart. She hadn't realized how much she'd changed. She had become stronger, not by hiding from her pain, but by confronting it, and she knew that this strength would stay with her forever. Suddenly, the distant rumbling returned, louder this time. They both rose quickly, their exhaustion pushed aside as adrenaline surged. Vera's heart pounded as she realized what it meant. Kaler had found them again. He wasn't willing to accept defeat so easily. This time, however, Vera felt no fear. She glanced at Jackson, whose eyes burned with renewed resolve. Despite his injuries, she realized she was ready, not because she was stronger or tougher than before, but because now she understood the power she carried within. "Are you ready?" Jackson asked, gripping his weapon tightly with his good hand, his voice strong with determination. Vera nodded firmly, stepping forward beside him, more ready than ever. As Kaler and his warriors emerged from the shadows, their leader's eyes glowed with hatred and fury. He raised his weapon, his voice dripping with contempt. "You humans, and your foolish allies. Your courage won't save you this time." But Jackson stood tall, his voice steady, echoing with strength. "Courage isn't foolish. It's why we're still standing. And we're not afraid of you." Kaler roared in anger and attacked, his warriors following closely behind. But Vera and Jackson were ready. They fought fiercely, side by side, their bond stronger than ever. Jackson pushed beyond every limit, fighting with an intensity that inspired Vera, despite the agony he felt. And this time, she matched his courage blow for blow, striking with confidence and determination she had never known before. Together, through pain and resilience, they forced Kaler into retreat once more. This time, his defeat was absolute, leaving no doubt in the hearts of his warriors that strength lay not in size or might, but in unwavering resolve. As the enemy disappeared into the darkness, silence filled the air. Jackson turned to Vera, breathless but triumphant. He laughed again, free, powerful, victorious. Vera smiled back broadly, her heart racing with exhilaration. "You're really crazy," she said playfully. Jackson chuckled through exhaustion. "Maybe. But I think you're starting to like crazy." "Maybe I am," she laughed softly. They stood side by side, knowing the war wasn't over, knowing there would be more battles ahead. But as long as they faced them together, Vera knew they could overcome anything. In that moment, beneath the vast expanse of stars, she finally understood fully. Strength didn't mean never falling. It meant rising every time you fell, smiling defiantly at the pain, and knowing you had the courage to stand again. As Vera looked toward the horizon, she realized their journey wasn't just about survival. It was about discovering the power of resilience, friendship, and the strength found in laughter, even through the darkest pain. Their story was far from over, but now she knew exactly how to face whatever lay ahead. By Jackson's side, laughing defiantly, unafraid of anything. Together, they would laugh through the pain. Together, they would always survive.